In recent videos, I've been talking a lot about the Conservative Party and Brexiteers, who form a large chunk of the Conservative Party, and it's very easy to do because they are in government, they're the one implementing Brexit, and quite frankly, they're the one making a whole host of utter cock-ups. So it's very easy to point to all their mistakes and to have lots of critical commentary on it. But I think in the interest of balance, we probably ought to switch things around a bit. So in this video, I'm actually going to talk about when the Conservatives were really good negotiators. Can you imagine such a thing? There was a time, and that was a long time ago. So I need to take you back in time to 2010, when politics was almost normal. Now, for those who might not remember the history or might not be familiar with British political history, I shall just recap briefly. Back in 2010, Gordon Brown was the Labour Prime Minister in charge, and he had to call a general election. He lost that general election. And the results were a hung parliament. So the Conservative Party, headed by David Cameron, were the top party but didn't have a majority. Labour were a very distant second, and the Liberal Democrats were the third party, and they had the biggest number of seats they've ever had, of 57 MPs. So what this resulted was quite a lot of drama at the time. This was a new thing, novel for British politics. So by the end of all of that, at the end of all the drama, the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative Party agreed a coalition agreement, which they finalised on the 20th of May 2010. So this was a coalition agreement that would allow David Cameron to be Prime Minister, the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party, Nick Clegg, to be the Deputy Prime Minister, and for the two parties to effectively run government jointly for the next 5 years, which they proceeded to do. And I think perhaps to many people's surprise, that coalition did actually last all the way until 2015, when the next general election was due. And at that particular point, the Liberal Democrats were electorally wiped out, and the Conservatives took control of government, and they still are today. So what happened, and why is this relevant in negotiation terms? And also what are the lessons that we can draw when looking at the events happening today? Well, to look into this a little bit, we have to focus quite a bit on the Liberal Democrats. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail on the coalition agreement. I will post a Wikipedia link and the video description below for people who perhaps want to dig in a bit further. But for the purpose of this video, I want to focus just on two areas. What the Conservatives did, what the Liberal Democrats did. Now, the two areas are electoral reform and tuition fees. And I highlight those because they were crucial issues for the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats were the party that had been campaigning for electoral reform for many decades. This was their opportunity. They were now going to get into government, and let's be honest, when you hold the balance of power, the ability to form the government before you sign the coalition agreement, that is the time to drive a bargain. You've got the power. And supposedly, this is what the Liberal Democrats were doing. They were going to put electoral reform on the agenda. They were going to try and govern compassionately. And it was their opportunity to show that they weren't just going to be a third-tier opposition party. They could actually be in government. Of course, as history shows us, that did not happen. And arguably, there are many reasons, but arguably it comes back to these two. They're signature issues, things that everyone remembers about them from that time, which is electoral reform and tuition fees. So what happened when it came to electoral reform? Well, there's two things that the Liberal Democrats secured agreement for in the coalition agreement. One, they secured a fixed-term parliament. And that was they would limit the power of the Prime Minister to call an election whenever they felt like it. It would now be fixed to 5 years. Well, history again shows that this didn't really work. Theresa May didn't obey that. Boris Johnson didn't obey that. And who knows, it looks like Boris Johnson may not obey that again. If rumours are true, that he will call another general election in the next year or two. So this sort of significant political change that Liberal Democrats secured most certainly did not stand the test of time. However, this is not particularly significant. What is significant in negotiation terms is the second thing that they supposedly were successful on. And this was that they secured a commitment to a referendum on changing the first past the post electoral system. Now, what you have to remember is that the Conservative Party, as then and as of now, does not want electoral change. The Conservative Party, and to some extent the Labour Party, are very happy with the first past the post system. It is a two-horse race. And you can pretty much argue that there isn't that much choice in British politics. Effectively, a bit of a game of musical chairs, and you only get two parties to choose from. So the Liberal Democrats want to change that, and very obviously this is something the Conservatives are not going to want. Now, during the course of the negotiations, the Conservatives are very much going to realise that this is top of the Liberal Democrat agenda, and if you want to be propped up in a coalition government, you've got to give the Liberal Democrats something. So I think they hatched up a cunning plan. They wanted to keep first past the post. The Liberal Democrat Party wanted proportional representation. Neither side's position was acceptable to the other. So an adversarial negotiation, as it were. So what the Conservatives did was they pushed the Liberal Democrats into a supposed compromise of going for an alternative vote electoral system. This was not one that Liberal Democrats had been campaigning for, but they agreed to this in the spirit of reaching a compromise. Now I'm going to dig into this because, you see, this is the reason why I'm loading the word compromise, is because actually it wasn't a compromise. It was a very cunning strategy by the Conservative negotiators. I think it was Dominic Grieve who negotiated that. I think opposite him was the like of Vince Cable, but I could be wrong. But what the Conservative Party did was they pushed the Liberal Democrats out of a system that they believed in. The Liberal Democrats believed in proportional representation. They don't understand or believe in the alternative vote. So when it came to actually campaigning for the referendum, you actually had even the side that was supposed to be in favour of the change not actually carrying that commitment because it wasn't what they wanted. So this supposed compromise that they reached in the coalition agreement actually was a sounded the death knell to electoral reform. So the Liberal Democrat basically blew their opportunity to force electoral reform on the agenda, because I'm reasonably sure that they could have made this a red line. They could have absolutely refused to compromise on the need to have proportional representation or even any electoral reform. They didn't have to specify what the electoral reform was going to be, just that there would be a referendum, and that the referendum would be, do you want to change the first past the post in the system? You could possibly have a two-tier referendum where you sort out the actual new system at a later date. Or the Liberal Democrats should have stuck to their preference for proportional representation and refused to form a government without that demand being met. They did not. They compromised. And this led to a massive failure. And this is a very core failure because the core, die-hard Liberal Democrat voter had wanted electoral reform for a very long time. So this was a massive failure on the Liberal Democrats' part. So that was their prospect of electoral reform, which still eludes British politics to this day. That was their opportunity, and they blew it. So let's look at the next thing, and everyone in British society will remember this. that the Liberal Democrats did sign a pledge that they would not increase tuition fees for students. And on the basis of that pledge, they got the young vote. They got a lot of students voting for them. Now, the coalition agreement was not specific on this point. The coalition did give the Liberal Democrats the option to abstain. But abstaining is not blocking. And essentially what did happen was the Liberal Democrats allowed the Conservatives to increase tuition fees, all in the name of austerity. And again, this was a key electoral pledge, directly made in their manifesto. They even got individual MPs to sign up to that pledge. So this was a blatant breach of their promise. Now they could dress it up. If they were in a coalition, you had to reach compromises somewhere. However, again, I have to point out, this is a core desire of the Liberal Democrat voter. So yet again, the Liberal Democrat Party had breached its commitment to its voter base. So the question then arises, why did they do this? Why did they agree to this thing? Why did they not stand firm and seek compromises in other areas? Well, there's two particular answers that I will always talk about. And I talk about this specific example when I run my training course. So this is a very familiar theme to me and my students. And what I talk about, and I always talk about it in negotiation training, is that you absolutely must identify and defend your red lines. And it was abundantly clear that the allure of going into government, of being given, even if partially, the reins of power, made the Liberal Democrats not protect their red lines. And they absolutely had to, even if that did mean they couldn't form government at the time, because that was a critical issue to their voter base, and they did not do it. So why perhaps were the Conservatives able to persuade them? Well, I think there's two factors. I think this is what I call fake collaboration, collaborative negotiation. What the Conservative negotiators did was they talked about austerity. They talked about what is in the key national interest. It was a difficult time. This was straight after the financial crisis. And they used that to apply emotional leverage on the Liberal Democrats, as well as the prospects of ministerial seats in government. So they were pretending that this was a compromise. But really it wasn't. I think because, in all honesty, I don't think this actually saved a lot of money in terms of the austerity program. So it wasn't really a necessary compromise that the Conservatives had to insist upon. And people can correct me, someone with more knowledge than I am, on what that policy was actually worth or how much money it saved, can correct me. I'm making some assumptions here. But the assumption I am making is that the Conservative negotiators carefully analysed the Liberal Democrat position. And they analysed what was crucial to them. And then they realised that they were able to reframe what the Liberal Democrats might see as red lines. And they did that by the use of language, particularly emotional language, like we must save the country, we must have some form of austerity, we must rescue the country from economic ruin, etc., etc. So by doing that, they created this fake cooperation, this fake collaboration, when really, the reality was they completely and utterly compromised the Liberal Democrat. Now, it would be too much to say this was the only reason why the Liberal Democrats were wiped out in 2015. There were other things, like they supported the austerity programme, like they propped up a quite unpopular Conservative government at that time, and a whole host of other reasons that I won't go into. But I wanted to draw upon these specific examples because they're really clear and obvious cases when the Liberal Democrats compromise because they failed to understand the power that they had and the need that they had to not compromise. So perhaps what are the lessons we can draw from this example? Well, apart from the fact that the Conservative Party can be very ruthless negotiators and utterly willing to destroy their opposition, we should ignore that particular lesson. But what we can see is that compromise is not always a good thing. You must defend your red line, and you must understand the reason for your red line. So one of the things I always caution about people is don't have fake red lines. Have positions and don't defend your position and give reason for it if you wish. But don't create fake red lines, because the thing about a red line is it cannot be compromised upon under any circumstances, really. If you do, your credibility in terms of negotiation position is completely and utterly undermined. So the Liberal Democrats did that. They compromised on an area they absolutely should not have done, and there was no real need to. They were pushed to it, and they were pushed into it because the Conservative Party understood not only what the Conservative Party wanted, for example, they didn't want electoral reform, but they also wanted to undermine the Liberal Democrats as a future force. At that time, the real prospect that the Liberal Democrats might even overtake Labour, become the second party. So I think the Conservative strategy was to destroy the Liberal Democrats. And they did that under the coalition agreement by locking them in to a 5-year deal that they couldn't get out of without undermining themselves, and where they had already undermined themselves by agreeing to various policies that they should not have done. So that very much linked into what the Conservative strategy was. Resist change, undermine the opposition, and set themselves up to retain even more power at a later date. So I thought this would be a timely reminder of what happened back then. And of course, this was different people. David Cameron, Dominic Grieve, all the others, they were able to negotiate this. There wasn't any Lord Frost or Michael Gove or whoever in the front runner, to negotiate these things. But this is what they did. The results can still be seen today. And the Liberal Democrats are a very distant third party, unable to capitalise on their success of 2010. And in no small measure, it was due to their own failings, but also due to the fact that they were outwitted and out-negotiated by a much better prepared and a much smarter Conservative negotiation team. So there's lessons to be learned there. I hope you found this short little revision back into history interesting, and welcome seeing some of the comments on this.